Welcome back, everyone. My name is António Gomes, and I'm Deputy Director of the Directorate for Financial and Enterprise Affairs and Head of Competition and Investment here at the OECD. I'm really pleased to see so many of you connected to this Competition Open Day from different countries around the world. And today I have the great pleasure and honor to welcome and introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Joseph Stiglitz. Professor Stiglitz was awarded the 2001 Nobel Prize in Economics and is one of the most enlightened and inspiring economists and thinkers of our time. He is currently professor at Columbia University in New York, chief economist at the Roosevelt Institute, and co-chair of the high-level expert group on the measurement of economic performance and social progress at the OECD. He is author of numerous influential books. Some of his most recent titles include Creating a Learning Society, The Great Divide, Globalization and Its Discontents Revisited, People, Power and Profits, and Rewriting the Rules of the European Economy, An Agenda for Growth and Shared Prosperity. Professor Stiglitz will be with us for about half an hour. He will share with us his insights on the future of competition policy, possibly digging into economic concepts that we may need to maintain and those that we may need to question, the root causes of the challenges we are facing, and ways in which we can address them. Perhaps we may also hear from Professor Stiglitz on the risks that the pandemic may present, or issues like the green transition, or even on the digital economy. So after Professor Stiglitz remarks, if there is time, we will open the floor to questions. So do not hesitate to send questions via the chat feature on your screen. Professor Stiglitz, thank you so much for joining us today at the OECD, and we all look forward to your insights. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, and thank you very much for having me. As many of you know, I believe very strongly that competition is essential for a well-functioning market economy, and that the work of the competition authorities is really vital to the maintaining of a competitive marketplace. What I'm going to do this morning, afternoon, depending on where you are, or evening, I'm going to give a very high-level view of competition and some of the changes that are occurring in our economy, in our understanding of competition policy. Let me begin by observing that, at least in many countries, certainly I know it's the case in the United States, there is considerable evidence of increased market concentration, evidence of higher markups. This is both direct evidence in the kind of, the share of the largest 2, 3, 4 companies in a given market, but also econometric evidence in terms of markups. We've come to understand the pervasiveness of market power, and areas that we hadn't really thought of before, partly because we are aware now that even a little market power in many different places can add up to a lot of market distortion. So just saying that there are a number of firms, that there is some competition, is not enough. When there is market power, it distorts the economy. Example of this is labor markets. It used to be not much attention was paid to market power in labor markets, but there is evidence of not only the examples of abuses of the kind that the digital companies engaged in Silicon Valley, where they conspired together, but little things like non-compete clauses put into fast food workers' contracts. This is not about stealing the secrets of how you do fast food service. This is not about intellectual property. This is about reducing competition. So we are aware that in sector after sector and place after place, there are limitations in market power. And I mean, there are limitations in competition, pervasiveness of market power. Where too that geographic nature, there may be many, many banks in the United States, but in any locality, there may be only 1, 2, or 3, enough for them to have tacit collusion. We've also become much more aware of the economic consequences. One of the big problems facing our societies that I've written a lot about is increasing inequality. But one of the consequences of market power in the product market is the power to raise prices. And raising prices relative to the cost of production, much of which is labor, means that real wages are lower. And that's contributing to inequality. The exercise of market power leads to some of our macroeconomic problems. Most people working in this field think of themselves as microeconomists and don't fully grasp the macroeconomic consequences. But at least for the United States, one of the things that we've observed is very high profit share, high seeming returns on capital, on investment, and very low investment rates. And of course, there's a natural explanation. The marginal return to investment in a market characterized by market power, the marginal return is lower than the average return. And so even though the average profit rate may be very high, the marginal profit rate may be very low, and that leads to lower levels of investment, and that leads to a weaker economy and monetary policies, which are low interest rates that help fuel real estate bubbles of the kind that we've seen. It also means there can be less and less well-directed innovation. The basic competitive model that many of you were taught in college puts innovation at one of the chapters at the end of the book. We don't think about the theory of innovation at the core, but it is one of the reasons we think competition is so important. But one of the aspects of innovation, I'll come to a little bit later, is when you have market power, much of your effort at innovation is directed at maintaining that market power, extending that market power, making it more durable, rather than making goods that are value to society. So there's less and less well-directed innovation. Now, given what I've just said, this increase in market power, it's natural, the next natural question for us to ask is why? How do we explain this? Because that's going to be important in shaping our thinking about what to do about it. Well, there have been changes in economic structure. As we move to a service sector economy, the service sector economy typically is more local. Transportation costs, as it were, is greater. Therefore, it gets more fragmented. And it's more fragmented in a sense over time. Goods can be stored, at least a lot of goods can. Services, much harder to store. So there is what we call intertemporal competition in goods, but there's not intertemporal competition in the same way in services. there are also changes in technology. The digital technology you mentioned in the beginning, our technologies where marginal costs are very low relative to the fixed costs, and those naturally lead to limited competition. It used to be when we had high fixed costs, like in electricity, we thought of this as a natural monopoly. But now that these are a characteristic of many of the key industries, we can't think of using natural monopoly regulation as running the digital economy. And so we're in a quandary. Many of the vital sectors of our economy are marked by limited competition. We don't have the scope for the kind of regulation we had in the natural monopolies of a century ago. Question is, what do we do? And as I mentioned before, there's been a lot of innovation in exercising market power. Let me just give you a couple of examples. Most of you know Microsoft's bundling of the browser. Very hard to compete with a browser that's being sold at a zero price. And Microsoft made it even worse because of their policy of FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, saying even if you paid for another browser, it risked undermining your operating system, essentially imposing a negative price on anybody else. That's an example, but we all know the cleverness of Amazon, the cleverness of Google in exercising market power. The innovation in contracts on two-sided markets that I'll maybe say a word about a little bit later is an example of ways of suppressing competition. In some cases, it's not that innovative. The provisions of secrecy are, Adam Smith talked about the role of secrecy in reducing competition. The fact that you can't sell to others at a lower price, that you can't even charge for the service, undermines competition and is in a way an old idea. So, but there's been a lot of this kind of innovation in contracts, innovation in ways of suppressing a competition, nonlinear pricing, loyalty cards, all kinds of things that economists have played an important role. I sometimes say here at Columbia, the business school and the economics department have a symbiotic relationship. In the business school, we try to think of ways of making competition less, and then the economics department thinks of ways of limiting the ability of the business school to come up with ideas to make reduce competition. That's sort of a joke, but it does illustrate the ambivalent role that economists have played, both in thinking through how we can exercise market power and how we can circumscribe the exercise of market power. Let me get ahead of the story for one moment, and I mentioned before the adverse effects of these efforts to undermine competition. One of the most, in my mind, invidious is the way in which the digital technologies are undermining the foundations of the efficiency of the market economy. The basis of the efficiency of the market economy, what is called the fundamental theorem of welfare economics, the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics, is that everybody faces the same prices, kind of neutrality in the market. It's what ensures, as we say in a technical sense, the margin rates of substitution of all individuals are the same. Marginal rate of transformations, margin rate of substitution equal margin rate of transformation. It is what ensures the efficiency of the market. But the digital platforms have been able to extract information that allows differentiated pricing, or that targeted advertising, that allow them to gather information on each individual and charge different prices for different individuals. It's called discriminatory pricing. In some cases, it has a racial discrimination. Some cases, it has a poverty discrimination. But in whatever the basis, the fact is that different individuals are facing different prices. And that undermines the foundations of what makes a market economy efficient. So what has been happening in, quote, our innovation in undermining competition is that we are in the process of destroying the basis of the efficiency of the market economy. And so I think we have to fully understand what makes a market economy is not just some notion of competition, but it's competition with certain kinds of rules, including non-discrimination. I was in the midst of trying to describe some of the forces that help explain the increase in market power. One of the forces is that we've responded to crises in ways that enhance market concentration. We saw that in the financial crisis in 2008, where a solution to many of the problems of weak banks that had been created in the run-up to 2008 was mergers. And that has meant we've emerged from the 2008 crisis with much less competition. The same thing has happened in the pandemic. A lot of worries about this, because in fact, the way, at least in the United States, money was allocated, it went disproportionately to better off firms. And the weaker firms obviously were weaker and were more prone to dying in the midst of the pandemic. Finally, as I mentioned before, another reason for the increase in market power is that competition authorities haven't kept up with the innovativeness in our non-competitive sectors and coming up with ways of leveraging their market power. An example I mentioned are the contracts, non-compete clauses I mentioned before, the kinds of contracts that are very common in platforms, the credit card contracts, the GDS contracts, contracts in two-sided markets. And here, unfortunately, in the United States, the Supreme Court didn't understand the economics of two-sided markets and came out on the wrong side. And that has been a problem, at least in the United States, in a number of the court cases, where the problem is that the courts have been too influenced by the Chicago School of Economics, which says that there is markets are naturally competitive and we don't have to worry about it. That has resulted in a whole set of presumptions, rulings, which make the enforcement of competition much more difficult. And that's what I want to talk in the last few minutes of my time, some of the rethinking in the conduct of competition policy and its foundations. And since I'm running out of time, I'll be very quick. On the conduct, the first thing I want to emphasize is there's a need for a change in the presumptions. The presumption in many of the courts in the United States and elsewhere is that markets are naturally competitive. All you need is potential competition, which is sometimes called the contestability doctrine. That is very important in determining, in legal cases, the burden of proof. Who has to prove what? And I think now the presumption should be markets are naturally not competitive. It takes only a little bit of sunk cost to undermine contestability, epsilon sunk cost. And that leads to another change in the conduct. It used to be that a lot of the normal form is you look at, define a market, you look at whether the firm has enough market share, and then that is at least the predicate of competition cases. But we now know with some of these complicated contracts, very subtle contracts, you can have a relatively small market share and still have a lot of market power. So there is direct evidence that ought to be brought to bear. If you are able to have a high markup, engage in discriminatory pricing, high profits, it creates, I believe, a presumption that the market is not working well. A rebuttable presumption, but a presumption nonetheless. In the United States, another aspect of the conduct has been the consumer welfare standard, looking at things through the eyes of the consumer. But as we see that there are many forms of anti-competitive behavior. If you have market power, monopsony power, you drive down the wage, even if that lower wage, the benefit of the lower wage is shared partly with consumers, it's not good for the economy. It's not good for societal well-being. So now some people say we ought to redefine what we mean by consumer to include a broader array, not only consumers, but workers, but then you're getting to what I think is the right standard, the well-being of society in a very broad sense. And that brings me to the foundations of competition policy. When competition policy began in the United States at the end of the 19th century, it was based on a concern about the exercise of market power, not only in the economy, but also in politics, in our society more broadly. And I believe it's part of a movement called the neo-Brandeisian movement in the United States to go back to the roots of competition policy and look at power more broadly. And that means that you are concerned with the abuse of market power, no matter how acquired. And here, the difference between the United States and Europe is very stark. In the United States, we've had abuses of market power, legitimately acquired, you might say, in the drug industry, where they raised the price 1,000% over costs, with enormous social costs. And in Europe, my understanding is that would normally be viewed as anti-competitive behavior and subject to remedial action. In the United States, it's not. And I think in that respect, the European approach of abuse of market power is right. And it's, as I say, part of a broader view of looking at market power competition from a broader public interest perspective. South Africa's public competition authority law does that. For instance, when the Walmart tried to take over Massmart and reduced the effect of reduced competition, one of the concerns was access to the supply chain and what it would do to small South African producers. And they said even if it was increasing the lowering prices for consumers, it was having adverse effects on society. And that also leads to thinking through new remedies. In the case of the South Africa case, they Massmart provided funds to help new South African producers enter the market and enter the supply chain, and therefore make a more competitive marketplace. Now, in the last few minutes, I want to emphasize that once you start looking at things from this broader lens, one becomes aware that the consequences, some dimensions of the consequences of lack of competition are greater in some markets than others. So for instance, I mentioned earlier the reduction in competition in financial markets that follow the 2008 financial crisis. We should be concerned about that for a number of reasons. One of them is, of course, that if you have financial institutions that are too big to fail, they engage in excessive risk-taking, a higher probability of a bailout, a less stable financial system, but also with a more concentrated financial market, unless you impose strong regulation, there may be problems of access to finance, particularly for new entrants into the marketplace. As you correctly anticipated, one of the areas where I think competition is really important, but in a very different way from the way it has typically been conceived, is the marketplace for ideas. Competition in the media should not be measured by whether there is a competitive marketplace for advertising defined in a particular way. If you have one person owning the newspaper, the TV station, the radio station in a particular locale, he can have a disproportionate influence in the dissemination of ideas. The social media, a few social media companies have disproportionate control of the mechanisms for the dissemination of ideas. And they have used that in ways that have not circumscribed a whole variety of digital harms that not behaved in what I would call a socially responsible way. So the upshot of that is that these are some of the areas where I think we have to have new standards that are more closely aligned with the broader conception of market power, not defined in a narrow economic sense, but in the sense that if you can shape the way large fractions of society see a particular problem, you have enormous power in our society. If you can shape how they think about competition and tell them competition is not important, that's power. So you use your power to extend and maintain that power. And that, of course, is one of the most dangerous aspects of market power, its perpetuation. So let me, with those just few remarks, open it up for discussion. I hope by these remarks have the effect of opening up the discussion and encouraging thinking about stronger competition laws, more remedies, changing presumptions, and so we get, in the end, a more competitive and a more dynamic society and economy.
Thank you so much, Professor Stiglitz. This was really a very, very rich presentation. And indeed, I think that everyone's objective is really to get a more competitive and more dynamic economy. You touched upon several issues. You started with market concentration increasing in market power that we're seeing, saying that we shouldn't forget labor markets and monopoly power in labor markets. You've touched upon inequality that I would say goes from both lack of competition in product markets, but also in labor markets, as you referred. The macro consequences of market power, innovation, but in the sense of innovative ways of extending market power and having and enlarging market power. Also, what technology is bringing to us, and that regulation is not, we cannot design it in the same way as we've had before, and all the issues with digital, with the zero price economy, with the price discrimination, the gathering of data in that context, et cetera, et cetera. I think it was really, really a very, very rich presentation, which led us as to the role of competition law ultimately, and how we should interpret the concept of market power itself, and the need for new standards. So so we have some questions from the audience already, but I wanted to ask you a question as well, and this is related to the pandemic, and the fact that on one hand we want more competition and more competitive markets. On the other side, we also see that industrial policy is back in the agenda of many countries, for example, to support the green transition. And my question to you is, what do you see as the role of industrial policy for innovation, for example, and for the economy as a whole? And do you think that we can have an industrial policy that is not simply promoting national champions, but can actually be used to promote entry and to promote competition? And is there any role for competition authorities there?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I think the industrial policies that are centered around national champions ought to be looked with some degree of skepticism. That the only case where that might be relevant is that where one can establish that there are sufficiently high returns to scale that that there is, in a sense, a natural monopoly. And even then, one has to trade off the benefits that one gets from the returns to scale from the losses that one gets from the lack of competition, because competition is a spur to innovation. So in general, I think industrial policies should be directed at the issues of what I call market failures. What I mean by that, we will invest normally too little for climate change. It's a public good. We haven't corrected the distortions associated with the price of carbon and broader environmental issues, and therefore there is inevitably going to be underinvestment in R&D and climate. And so industrial policies that encourage us to move towards green technologies make a great deal of sense. The work of the OECD, the IMF, my own book, The Price of Inequality, highlighted another market failure externality associated with excessive inequality. So with my colleague, Anton Korenek, we've been talking about the role of government in steering technology towards innovations that don't replace labor, but augment labor, make labor more productive. So it's not in societal interest to have more unemployment of unskilled workers, but that's where a lot of our innovation is directed. So that's another example of industrial policy. So I think there are lots of areas where the government ought to intervene in the R&D process, but not to create national champions.
Excellent. So I'll go to a question of one of our attendees. So we have Antoine Perrotin from Chile's Senior Legal Counsel asking, how could we use broader societal considerations to shape new competition law standards to regulate oligopolistic digital platforms? And maybe I'll add to this also, how can we look at, for example, issues like data and privacy? Is competition law the right forum to deal with these issues?
Well, first let me say that the digital platforms have engaged in a large number of anti-competitive practices, self-preference. They control, they have market dominance, at least a lot of market power in their control of the platforms, and then they leverage that market power through a whole variety of techniques that Lena Khan has talked about in the context of Amazon, that the DMA in Europe has talked about, and the competition authorities in Europe have tried to stop. So a study of all those kinds of anti-competitive practice is a beginning. It's just a beginning of what has to be done. And as it's a kind of regulation. It's a minimal regulation. It's a regulation of actions that make what is naturally a marketplace with limited competition even less competitive. And it's a regulation that stops the extension of the market power into other areas. So that seems to me a beginning. The question of where do you, quote, put privacy and lots of the other digital harms is the appropriate place, competition authority. Well, in the United States, the FTC, the Fair Trade Commission, brings together in the concept of fair trade a whole set of ideas, competition being one, taking advantage of consumers, reduces competition, but is also directly an unfair trade measure. And one of the ways in which you abuse market power is through privacy. We've seen that in the case of Facebook. So in some ways, there is a abuse, you can say individuals would obviously care about their privacy, and their ability to exercise that care is in part a reflection of Facebook's market power. So it is a market power issue. But one of my areas of my work I did earlier was about how imperfect information gives rise to market power. Consumers often don't know the nature of what are the invasions of privacy, what are the consequences of their disclosing information. I mentioned in my talk, for instance, how using data allows for targeted advertising, which can be viewed as a way of rent extraction out of consumers to make them worse off. But they don't typically know this. I was in a dinner once where one of the big internet companies, the CEO of the internet company, was very proudly saying how he didn't use this word, dupe his consumers by offering them a minuscule amount of money and they'll give them all their data. And then he can use that data to extract a lot of rents out of them worth much more than the small amount of money that he'd given them. Well, is that a competition issue, or is that a abusive consumers issue? I think the line is very fine, and that's why I think we ought to think of that broader perspective of regulating the marketplace for enhancing the well-being of everybody, consumers, workers, as what really competition authorities in a broad sense do. That's the redefinition that I was trying to encourage. In fact, if you do that, you get a more competitive marketplace. The two are so intimately connected that I think the idea of parceling them out is a mistake. Now, administratively, the way this is done in the FTC is they have a Consumer Protection Bureau and they have a bureau on competition, but they speak to each other. And as we've gotten into the digital companies, we have increasingly realized that these two pieces are very interconnected.
Excellent. I think that we've actually come to the end of our time. Unfortunately, we had other interesting questions, so that you know, questions on, for example, introducing special taxes on goods traded online, if that would increase prices to consumers, and do you think that what would be the optimal instrument to regulate prices of such goods? Others that have to do with all the state support and state aid during the pandemics, and if you saw that there would be a soft landing, and etc. Whether also price discrimination could not be in favor of some consumers that have lower wages and could pay lower prices than richer consumers. But anyway, we would stay here for much longer. Unfortunately, our time is up. I really want to thank you so much for joining us. It was really such a great pleasure and honor to have you here. It was very, very, very insightful to hear your views, and also to have this, in a way, some guidelines on what could be the future of competition law and policy. Thank you so much, and we'll. I hope so. I ask everyone to stay online, because we'll have a 30-second break, and then we'll move into the next session that will be on regulation and competition enforcement in digital markets, and it will be moderated by Anya Tiemann. Thank you so much, Professor Stiglitz, and thank you, everyone.